In the late summer of 2023, when the drought had baked the clay of Three Creeks Valley into a network of cracks that looked like a map of a broken world, Silas Blackwood did something that made no sense. He took in 35 head of Piney Woods cattle that nobody else would buy, not even for the price of transport. They were small, rangy animals, more bone and bristle than beef, and in a year when a single bale of hay cost $87, they were seen as 35 walking liabilities. Then he did something that made even less sense. He opened a gate that hadn't been swung in 40 years and let them disappear into the 180 acres his neighbors called the worthless quarter. Let me tell you about Three Creeks Valley. It wasn't named for 3 grand rivers. It was named for 3 seasonal trickles, Briar Creek, Stone Creek, and the Little Fork, that were, by August of that year, nothing more than dusty scars on the landscape. The valley sits in a rain shadow, a geographic apology tucked behind the eastern ridges of the Appalachian foothills. For 200 years, its survival had depended not on abundance, but on a delicate, hard-won understanding of scarcity. The soil is thin, a mix of acidic clay and shale that resists the plow. The good bottomland is scarce, maybe 2,000 acres in total, spread among 24 families. The rest is steep hillsides covered in scrub pine, sweet gum, and a dense, thorny undergrowth that could tear a man's jeans to shreds in 10 paces. Silas Blackwood was 72 years old. He had been farming this specific 412-acre parcel for 55 of those years, since his father, Elias, had suffered a coronary event while mending a fence line at the age of 51. Silas wasn't known for talking. He was known for watching. He'd stand at the edge of a field for an hour, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on something nobody else could see. The angle of the sun, the way the wind moved through the fescue, the specific shade of green on a stand of corn. His physical description was minimal. A man shaped by work, wearing the uniform of his trade, faded denim, worn leather boots, and a perpetually sweat-stained cap. His posture, however, spoke volumes. It was a posture of deep-rooted patience, as if he were a part of the landscape itself, as permanent and unhurried as the oak trees that dotted his pastures. The farm had been in the Blackwood family since 1888, purchased for $4 an acre by Silas's great-grandfather, a man who had walked there from the coast with little more than a set of tools and a cloth sack of saved seed. That history wasn't just a story, it was a physical presence. The main gate to the farm was hung on 2 massive locust posts his grandfather had set in 1927. The heavy oak table in the kitchen, where all decisions were made, was built by his great-grandfather from a tree cleared from the original home site. And in the barn, hanging from a wooden peg, was a canvas bag. It was stained with the oils of 100 seasons. This bag held the unwritten rules of the farm, passed down not in words, but in practice. One of those practices concerned the cattle. The Blackwood herd was not the sleek, uniform black Angus or the heavy, muscular Charolais that graced the covers of modern livestock journals. They were Piney Woods cattle, a heritage breed descended from the first Spanish cattle brought to the Americas in the 1500s. They were small, with mature cows rarely topping 800 pounds. Their coats came in a chaotic patchwork of colors: reds, blacks, duns, and speckled patterns. Their horns twisted in a dozen different shapes. By every modern metric, they were inefficient. They grew slowly, had a lower dressing percentage, and produced less milk. But they had one quality that spreadsheets couldn't measure. They belonged to the valley as much as the shale and the scrub pine. They could thrive on the poor forage, navigate the steep terrain, and withstand the heat, humidity, and insects of a southern summer with a stoicism that bordered on indifference. They were, in the words of Silas's father, hard keepers, but easy doers. They asked for little and wasted nothing. This philosophy of belonging was becoming obsolete. The world had changed, and the pressure on the farmers of Three Creeks Valley was immense. It wasn't a single, dramatic event, but a slow, grinding accumulation of debt and desperation. The price of fuel had tripled in 10 years. A new tractor cost more than Silas's great-grandfather had paid for the entire farm, adjusted for inflation. The local co-op, once a genuine cooperative of neighbors, had been absorbed by a multi-state agricultural corporation, AgriSolutions, based 800 miles away in a glass tower in Minneapolis. And AgriSolutions had a plan for Three Creeks Valley. The plan arrived in the form of a man named David Chun. Chun was 34 years old, had a master's degree in agricultural economics from Iowa State University, and had been with AgriSolutions for 6 years. He was known for his sharp presentations, his mastery of data, and his unshakable confidence. He dressed not like a farmer, but like the banker to farmers. Crisp polo shirts, clean khaki pants, and expensive, spotless boots he only wore for farm visits. He was not a villain. He was a well-meaning professional who genuinely believed he was helping. He saw the valley not as a home, but as a portfolio of underperforming assets. Let me tell you about his presentation because it was the moment the two worlds collided. It was a Tuesday night in March 2023 at the Volunteer Fire Hall. About 40 farmers were there, men and women with worry etched into their faces. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and anxiety. Chun stood at the front, a laptop projecting a PowerPoint slide onto the wall. The slide was titled, "Maximizing Genetic Potential: The Path to Profitability." He spoke with the easy confidence of a man who believes in his numbers. He showed them charts comparing the feed conversion ratio of a typical piney wood steer, around 9-to-1, to AgriSolutions' proprietary breed, the ProGrow 900, a stunning 55-to-1. He showed them satellite-generated maps of their own farms, color-coded for forage quality. He showed them growth rate projections, calving interval statistics, and market price forecasts. "Folks," he said, his voice resonating with sincerity, "I know things are tough. The old ways are comfortable. They're familiar. But the market doesn't pay for familiarity. It pays for pounds. The ProGrow 900 is the result of millions of dollars in genetic research. It's an animal engineered for the modern market. Faster weight gain, higher carcass yield, and a premium price at the sale barn. We're talking about a 30% increase in revenue per animal unit." He clicked to the next slide. It showed a picture of a ProGrow 900. It was a magnificent beast. A solid, muscular block of black beef, perfectly uniform, standing in a pristine, manicured pasture. It looked like money. The farmers were listening. They were tired of breaking even, tired of watching their neighbors sell out. The promise of a 30% increase was a powerful siren song. One farmer, a man named Tom Calloway who was 62 and drowning in debt, raised his hand. "What's the catch, David? What do they eat?" Chin smiled. It was the question he was waiting for. "They require a specific nutritional program to unlock that genetic potential. AgriSolutions provides a custom blended feed, our Finisher 40 ration. We deliver it right to your farm. The cost of the feed is higher per ton, yes, but the efficiency gains more than offset it. It's about return on investment." He had a slide for that, too. A complex graph with lines for input costs and output value, crossing at a point labeled Profitability Apex. Silas Blackwood was there. He sat in the back as always. He hadn't said a word. He just watched. He watched the faces of his neighbors, saw the hope warring with the skepticism. He watched David Chun, a man who knew everything about cattle except what it felt like to pull a calf in a freezing rain at 2 a.m. Silas's grandson Liam was there too. Liam was 22, and he had spent his entire life watching his grandfather work. He loved Silas, but he was a product of his generation. He had a smartphone in his pocket and a belief that progress was linear. He was captivated by Chen's presentation. The data, the science, the promise of a system that worked. It was everything the slow, patient, intuitive world of his grandfather was not. After the meeting, Liam approached Chun. "That was amazing," he said. "The data is undeniable." Chun clapped him on the shoulder. "It's just math, Liam. We're taking the guesswork out of it. Your grandfather is a good man, but this is a business, not a museum." The conversation that spring and summer in Three Creeks Valley was all about the ProGrow 900. 6 farmers, including Tom Calloway, took out loans co-signed by AgriSolutions to buy breeding stock. They plowed under their diverse pastures of fescue, clover, and native grasses and planted the monoculture perennial rye that Chen's soil maps recommended. The Big Blue Agri-Solutions feed trucks started making regular runs down the valley's narrow roads. Silas did nothing. He kept his strange, multicolored cattle. He watched his pastures grow as they always did. He and Liam began to have conversations that felt more like debates. They'd be fixing a fence and Liam would bring it up. He'd say, "Grandpa, Mr. Chen's data shows Callaway's new calves are gaining 32 pounds a day. Ours are lucky to gain 15. Silas would pull a staple from his leather pouch, set it on the post, and say without looking up, "The land here doesn't like to be rushed. But Mr. Chen says we're leaving money on the table. We're inefficient." Silas would drive the staple home in 2 clean strikes. He'd look at the fence line stretching over the hill. Inefficient is a word invented by a man who's never had to survive a 7-year drought. His grandfather told him that in 1936. The words hung in the air, a piece of inherited wisdom that felt, to Liam, like stubbornness. Then the rain stopped. It wasn't sudden. It was a slow, cruel tapering off. May was dry. June was drier. By July, the creeks were gone. The official weather station 40 miles away in the county seat recorded only 8 inches of rain from June 1st to August 15th. The temperature hovered above 95 degrees for 34 consecutive days. The valley, which was always on the edge, tipped over. The monoculture rye fields of the Progro farmers were the first to go. They were shallow-rooted, designed for optimal conditions, not for stress. They turned a sickly yellow, then a brittle brown. The cost of the finisher 40 feed, which was tied to the price of corn and soy on the commodities market, jumped 22% in 6 weeks. The magnificent Progro 900 cattle, engineered for a feedlot, began to suffer. Their glossy coats grew dull. They stood listlessly by the empty feed troughs, their heavy bodies radiating heat. They were machines designed for a specific fuel, and their fuel was becoming prohibitively expensive. Silas's pastures looked better, but only by comparison. The deep-rooted fescue and native grasses were hanging on, but they were stressed. He began rotating his herd faster, giving the land more time to rest. His piney woods cattle, however, seemed unfazed. They left the open pastures in the heat of the day and moved into the wooded hillsides, browsing on leaves, briars, and weeds that the Progro cattle wouldn't touch. They were losing a little condition, but they were surviving. They were doing what they had done in this valley for 300 years. The crisis came to a head in late August. Tom Callaway, his credit exhausted and his spirit broken, had to sell his herd. But the market was flooded. Everyone was selling. The magnificent Progro 900s, which he had bought for $2,500 a head, sold for $900. He lost his farm. He was the first, but everyone knew he wouldn't be the last. That was when Mark Albright, another neighbor, called Silas. Albright had a small herd of 35 piney woods cattle, a remnant population he'd kept out of family tradition, much like Silas. He was 68 and his health was failing. He couldn't afford the hay. He couldn't afford the work. "Silas," he said, his voice thin over the phone, "I've got to get out. Nobody will take these cattle. The sale barn won't even give me a floor price. They're a drag on the market, they say. Can you? I don't know. I can't just shoot them." Silas was silent for a long moment. He was standing in his kitchen, looking at the old oak table. He could feel the weight of 72 years, the aches in his joints, the thinness of his own resources. Taking on 35 more mouths to feed in the worst drought in a generation was, by any rational measure, an act of folly. "I'll take them, Mark," he said. "What do you want for them? Just get them here." 2 days later, Albright's rusty stock trailer pulled up Silas's drive. Liam came out of the house, his face a mask of disbelief. "Grandpa, what are you doing? We barely have enough grazing for our own herd. Hay is almost $90 a bale." David Chun happened to be in the valley that day, doing damage control with his Progro clients. He saw the trailer and pulled his clean white pickup in behind it. He got out, shaking his head in a gesture of paternal disappointment. "Silas," he said, his tone gentle, as if speaking to a confused child. With all due respect, this is a mistake. My data indicates we have, at best, 25 more days of available forage in this entire valley. You're adding 35 animal units to a system that's already in deficit. You're throwing good money, or in this case, good grass, after bad. These animals are genetically obsolete. Their feed conversion ratio is a liability in this environment. Silas looked at Chun. He looked at the cattle crammed into the trailer, small, scared, a chaotic mix of colors and horns. He looked at his grandson, who was standing beside Chun, nodding in agreement. Then he looked past them, up the hill toward the northern edge of his property, toward the 180 acres of dense, tangled wilderness known as the Worthless Quarter. Let me tell you about the Worthless Quarter. It was a section of the farm that hadn't been grazed in Silas's lifetime. His grandfather had fenced it off in the 1940s after a wildfire. Over the next 80 years, nature had reclaimed it with a vengeance. It was an impenetrable thicket of thorny locust, multiflora rose, privet, and vines as thick as a man's arm. The land was steep and rocky. No one had set foot in it for at least 40 years. It was considered to have a grazing capacity of 0. It was a blank spot on David Chen's colorful satellite maps. Silas turned to Liam. Get the wire stretchers and some staples. Meet me at the North Gate. The North Gate. It was more myth than entrance. The posts were solid locust, set by Silas's grandfather, but the wire was rusted through, and a 40-year accumulation of logs, leaves, and dirt had buried the bottom. It took Silas and Liam an hour of hard labor in the blistering heat to clear it. Liam was muttering the whole time. This is crazy. There's nothing in here for them to eat. They'll starve. Silas didn't answer. He worked. He pulled the old wire free. He put his shoulder to the heavy gate and, with a groan of protesting wood and rusted hinges, pushed it open for the first time since 1983. The opening revealed a wall of green and brown darkness, a tangle of vegetation that seemed to swallow the light. They drove the new cattle up the lane. The animals were hesitant, smelling the strange, wild place. But their desperation was greater than their fear. One by one, they lowered their heads and pushed into the undergrowth, disappearing into the thicket with a rustle of leaves and a snapping of twigs. In 5 minutes, all 35 were gone. Chun had followed them up the hill. He stood with his arms crossed, a look of profound, data-driven pity on his face. Silas, I admire your sentiment, truly, but you're sending them in there to die. Silas looked at Chun. He looked at the dark opening where the cattle had vanished. He thought of the rule that wasn't written down, the one he'd learned from watching his father and grandfather. Let the land tell you what it needs and let the animal do the work. He just said, they know this land better than your maps do. Then he and Liam closed the gate. They didn't lock it. They just fastened it with a loop of fresh, new wire. The sound of the gate closing echoed in the quiet, hot air. It was a decisive sound. It was the sound of a bet being made. The next 2 months were the hardest the valley had ever known. The drought didn't break. The temperature for September averaged 6 degrees above normal. 2 more of the Progro farmers sold their herds at a catastrophic loss. The big blue Agri-Solutions trucks stopped coming. The silence on the roads was eerie. David Chen's visits became less frequent. When he did show up, his confidence was gone, replaced by a kind of weary defensiveness. His system, so perfect on paper, had failed its first real-world stress test. The problem with a system designed for the apex is that it shatters in the trough. Liam watched his grandfather. Silas grew thinner. The worry showed in the lines around his eyes, but his routine never changed. He was up before dawn, walking the fences, checking the main herd, monitoring the remaining grass. He spent hours just standing, watching. He never went near the Worthless Quarter. Aren't you going to check on them? Liam asked one evening. It's been 6 weeks. Silas was cleaning a piece of tack at the old oak table. The smell of leather oil filled the kitchen. They can't do their work if I'm watching them, he said. What work? Liam asked, exasperated. They're just trying to survive. That's the work, Silas replied. By late October, the valley was a study in shades of brown. The leaves had fallen from the deciduous trees, not with the vibrant colors of autumn, but with a dry, defeated sigh. The wells of 3 of Silas's neighbors ran dry. People were talking about selling not just their herds but their land. The community was dying. There was a meeting at the fire hall, not with a confident consultant, but just with each other. The mood was funereal. The question on everyone's lips was, how do we get through the winter? The day after that meeting, David Chun came back. He drove his white pickup down Silas's lane, not with the brisk purpose of a salesman, but with the slow reluctance of a man on his way to a difficult appointment. Liam saw him pull up and went out to meet him. "I'm here to apologize to your grandfather," Chun said. His voice was quiet. The unshakable confidence had been replaced by a hard-won humility. "My models were wrong. I pushed too hard. I didn't account for this." He gestured at the parched landscape. "I'd like to see those cattle, the ones he took in. I need to understand what happened." Liam found Silas in the barn, mending a harness. He relayed Chen's request. Silas looked at Liam, then at the harness in his hands, a piece of leather that had belonged to his father. He nodded. The 3 of them, the old man, the young man, and the humbled expert, got into Silas's battered farm truck and drove up the lane to the north gate without speaking. The silence was heavy with unspoken arguments, with the weight of the last 8 months. When they got to the gate, the first thing they noticed was the change. The wall of darkness was gone. Through the gate, they could see light and space. They could see the trunks of trees. The impenetrable thicket was penetrable. Silas unfastened the wire and swung the gate open. He led the way, with Chun and Liam following. They stepped into a different world. The ground was clear. The years of accumulated leaf litter had been scuffed and trampled, mixed with manure, turning into a rich, dark layer on top of the clay. The multiflora rose bushes were stripped bare, their thorny canes chewed down to nubs. The privet was gone. The cattle had cleared the understory with a devastating surgical precision. And the animals themselves were there, scattered among the trees. They were not just alive. They were thriving. Their coats were sleek, their eyes bright. They were fat. They had spent 3 months feasting on a buffet of vegetation that Chen's forage analysis would have dismissed as worthless. They had converted thousands of pounds of thorny, invasive biomass into healthy protein. Chen stopped, stunned. He ran a hand through his hair. "I don't understand," he whispered. "The nutritional value of this, it's negligible. My software would classify this as zero-yield forage. How is this possible?" Silas looked at the cattle browsing peacefully. They weren't designed in a lab. They were designed by this place, over 500 years of drought, flood, and famine. They carried the memory of the land in their genetics. "They are not converting forage," he said. "They are restoring pasture." But that was not the climax of the story. That was just the preamble. Silas kept walking, deeper into the newly cleared woodland, toward the center of the 180-acre plot. Chun and Liam followed, their eyes wide. The land sloped gently downward into a wide, shallow basin, a depression maybe 3 acres in size. Before, this area had been the thickest part of the jungle, a place where the sun never reached the ground. Now it was open. The ground was dark and damp under their feet. And in the very center of the basin, something was gleaming. It was a patch of mud, then a foot-wide puddle of black, clear water. As they watched, another trickle of water seeped up from the ground and joined it. And another. The earth itself seemed to be weeping with relief. Chun stared, his mouth agape. Liam knelt down, touching the edge of the water with his fingertips as if it were a miracle. "What is this?" Chun asked, his voice barely a whisper. Silas stood at the edge of the slowly filling depression. He looked at the water seeping from the ground he had known his entire life but had never truly seen. He remembered a story his grandfather had told him, a vague, half-forgotten tale from the great drought of the 1930s, about a place on the north side of the property they called the Clay Pan Spring, a place that had dried up and been forgotten, swallowed by the relentless growth of the brush after the cattle were pulled off it. For 50 years, the invasive, thirsty vegetation had acted like a billion straws, sucking every drop of moisture from the ground before it could ever reach the surface. The water table had been suppressed, held hostage by the thicket. The piney woods cattle hadn't just cleared the brush. They had removed the straws. They had performed a kind of ecological surgery, and now the land could breathe again. The ancient, slow spring was re-emerging. "This is what was here before," Silas said quietly. He walked to the lowest point, where the water was now a pool a few yards across. He knelt down, his old knees protesting. He didn't scoop the water in his hands. He didn't make a grand gesture. He simply placed his palm flat on the surface. He held it there for a long moment, feeling the impossible coolness, the pulse of the land returning. That was the decisive moment. A 72-year-old man, with his hand in a puddle of muddy water in the middle of 180 acres that everyone had called worthless. There was no shouting. No "I told you so," the only sounds were the quiet seep of water from the earth and the distant, contented chewing of the cattle. David Chun stood frozen, his spreadsheets and data charts dissolving in his mind, replaced by this undeniable physical reality. His entire system was based on maximizing outputs, pounds of beef, dollars per head. He had never considered that the most valuable output might be the work the animal does for free, the work of healing the land, the work of uncovering a forgotten spring. He had been trying to sell the farmers a better engine, when what they needed was a better map. And the map wasn't on a satellite. It was in the bones of the animals that belonged there. Liam looked from the emerging pond to his grandfather's back. For the first time, he did not see stubbornness. He saw a depth of knowledge so profound it looked like simplicity. He understood that his grandfather wasn't managing cattle. He was in a partnership with the land, and the cattle were the mediators of that partnership. The most important line in the story was spoken later that night, back at the old oak table. Liam was quiet, thoughtful. He finally looked at Silas and said, You knew the water was there." Silas was wiping down the table with a damp cloth, a ritual he performed every night. He shook his head. "No, I didn't know. But I knew the land needed something, and I trusted the cattle to find it." The aftermath unfolded with the same slow pace as the rest of the story. The clay pan spring, as Silas began to call it again, continued to fill. By the time the winter rains finally arrived in late November, it was a 3-acre pond, 12 feet deep at its center. It held an estimated 45 million gallons of water. It became the only significant surface water source in the entire valley that was not dependent on immediate rainfall. It made Silas Blackwood's farm resilient. While his neighbors' stock ponds were still dangerously low, his was full. He had not just saved 35 cattle. He had secured his farm's future. David Chun resigned from AgriSolutions 2 months later. He didn't leave agriculture. He took a job with a small nonprofit focused on land restoration and heritage breeds. The last time Silas heard, Chun was working with ranchers in New Mexico, not with spreadsheets but with soil samples and deep, patient observation. He was learning a new kind of math. The ProGrow 900 program collapsed in Three Creeks Valley. The remaining farmers who had bought and sold their stock and went back to hardier, more traditional breeds. The uniform, manicured rye fields were plowed under, and the farmers began planting the diverse, chaotic-looking mixes of deep-rooted grasses and legumes that could survive a drought. They were rebuilding resilience, not chasing apex profitability. Liam did not leave the farm. He stayed. He started walking the land with his grandfather, not talking but watching. He carried a notebook, but he wasn't recording numbers. He was drawing maps of where the water flowed after a rain, noting which plants the cattle ate in a dry spell, learning the names of the trees and the habits of the birds. He was inheriting the real knowledge, the kind that can't be put on a PowerPoint slide. The following spring, 3 of his neighbors came to Silas, not to ask for advice, but to buy calves from the herd of 35 worthless cattle that had saved a farm by clearing some brush. They paid $1,200 a head and felt they were getting a bargain. The money was secondary. What they were buying was a piece of the valley's memory. What survives is not always what is most efficient according to a formula. A system optimized for a single outcome is brittle. It shatters under stress. True resilience is born from diversity, from a deep and complex relationship between a place and the life it supports. It is messy, chaotic, and inefficient on paper, but it endures. Sometimes the most valuable work is the work that is not measured. And sometimes the only way to find what has been lost is to trust in the wisdom of something that has never left.